In tonight's Spotlight, President Obama has concluded that the Defense of Marriage Act, known as DOMA, is unconstitutional. DOMA defines marriages as only between a man and a woman. It passed in 1996 with the support of such liberal senators as Joe Biden, Harry Reid, Barbara Mikulski, Tom Daschle, Pat Leahy, Jay Rockefeller, and Paul Wellstone. Today, Attorney General Eric Holder sent a letter to Speaker John Boehner informing him that the administration will no longer defend DOMA in appeals courts because, quote, much of the legal landscape has changed in the 15 years since Congress passed the law. Holder said Obama concluded that DOMA fails to meet a rigorous standard under which courts view with suspicion any laws targeting minority groups who have suffered a history of discrimination. John Boehner's press secretary replied, while Americans want Washington to focus on creating jobs and cutting spending, the president will have to explain why he thinks now is the appropriate time to stir up a controversial issue that sharply divides the nation. DOMA will remain in effect, and the administration will continue to enforce the law until a federal court abolishes it or Congress repeals it. White House Press Secretary Jay Carney said today the president is still, quote, grappling with the issue of gay marriage. In December, President Obama said that he supported civil unions for gay and lesbian couples, but that his position on gay marriage was, quote, constantly evolving because I am a politician. Okay, he didn't say the because I am a politician part. Joining me now is Glenn Greenwald, contributing writer to Salon.com. Glenn, that's really what it is, right, with this president? You're watching a politician grapple with an issue, not a constitutional law professor or a man.
Well, I think in general, you're right. In general, that's true. But I think this is actually a case where that may not be that true. And I say this as a fairly frequent critic of the Obama administration, but this seems to be a case where what they did really does deserve enthusiastic, unqualified praise. And that's because the cynic might say that this is being done to accommodate an important part of the Democratic constituency, but it's really not true because gay groups have been fairly placated by the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This was not really an item high on the list for gay groups. And on the other side, you have social conservatives and right-wing groups who still are triggered by gay marriage. Only a few years ago, dozens of states voted to make bans on gay marriage part of their constitution. So this is a case where there's a fair amount of political risk, very little political benefit, and yet what they did is not only right on the merits, but really takes a big step toward removing a grave injustice that plagues the lives of tens of thousands of gay Americans.
Now, elaborate on this distinction. They're going to continue to enforce it, but they're not going to defend its constitutionality on appeal? Is that where we are?
Well, that's an important distinction, and we should be glad that that distinction is being made by the administration, because what they're saying is there are lawsuits currently pending where the constitutionality of this law is being challenged, and generally it's up to the Justice Department to defend the constitutionality of any statutes that Congress passes, unless, and lots of administrations previously have done this, they believe that it's so unconstitutional that they can't in good faith defend the constitutionality. And that's what the administration is saying. But until Congress appeals it or until a court strikes it down with finality, it still is the law of the land, and the president is therefore bound by the Constitution to continue to enforce it even though he believes it's unconstitutional. That's the controversy of the Bush administration. They would say, we think this law is unconstitutional, therefore we won't follow it. And you don't want presidents doing that.
Mm-hmm. And so there is precedent at the presidential level, at the administration level, to decide we no longer feel we can defend in the appeals process the constitutionality of a given law.
Absolutely. The Clinton administration refused to defend the constitutionality of a law that said that people who have HIV can't serve in the military. The Reagan administration went into court and said they thought the independent counsel statute that Congress passed was unconstitutional. Many administrations, going back to Roosevelt and even before, have said we're obligated to enforce this law, but in court we refuse to defend it as being constitutional because we don't think think it can be defended in good faith.
What do you make of John Boehner's reaction? It sounds kind of muted. He didn't rush to the microphones to wave his hands and get all hysterical about this. It's just a written statement of not saying anything terribly inflammatory.
Yeah, I think that the right wing of the Republican Party, at least the establishment part of it, had made the decision that the reason they won this last election was because of issues concerning the economy and spending, and that social issues really don't play well with independent voters, and you've seen them move away from it. The problem is they rely on voters who care a lot about these issues, and I think you're going to see a lot more inflammatory rhetoric coming from the right wing of the Republican Party over this issue. That's why I think there's political risk involved.
You know, I mentioned some of the liberal Democratic senators who voted for the Defense of Marriage bill back 15 years ago to show that there is, in fact, a real evolution on this subject, that there are people who have changed their minds over time about it, and that there are plenty of people in the last 15 years who've moved in the direction of gay marriage. And do you think that we're going to get to the point where you can actually be the president? None of the people running for president last year, who in 2008, who were serious contenders for the Democratic nomination, could come out and say, I'm in favor of gay marriage. How far away are we from that possibility?
Well, what's amazing is, I mean, when I litigated cases back in the early part of the decade, I actually was involved in a case where I took the position that the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional, that gay people should be treated like women and African Americans under the law of the Constitution. And back then, almost nobody was arguing that. It was a very radical position, and now a mere 9 years later, you have the Justice Department officially taking that position on behalf not just of DOMA, but all issues involving gay Americans. And so the fact that the president is saying that he's grappling with the issue of gay marriage, I think, is a signal that he very well may come out and change his mind and say that he now favors it. Polls clearly show a divided country, even on the most extreme question, which is, should the government recognize same-sex marriages? And there's a real belief that it's unjust to deny gay people and gay couples the same rights as straight couples, and that's really ultimately what DOMA is about.
Scheme out for us, where do you think we go from here? If the Justice Department makes this decision today, where are we going to be 2-3 years from now on this?
Well, you know, I don't think there's much hope that Congress will repeal it, given who controls Congress, and even when the Democrats did, they showed no interest in doing so. I don't think they're ready to take that risk. But the reason why this is so momentous is because federal courts, when it comes to determining the constitutionality of statutes, listen to the Justice Department. And if the Justice Department is standing up and saying there is no legitimate basis for this discriminatory law, we can't identify any legitimate government interest, that has a major impact on how federal courts and ultimately the Supreme Court, which is clearly where this is headed, will end up assessing this issue.
Glenn Greenwald, contributing writer to Salon.com, thanks for being with us on this big win today.
My pleasure.